Welcome, Greek mythos and the pre-Socratics. In this video, we will go through this outline and talk just to give everyone a sense of what's going on in this handout. And the pattern of this handout is similar to what we will encounter throughout the semester. That when it's relevant or helpful, we'll talk about some of the historical context of the time period we're considering, and then we'll consider like the questions, the answers, the argumentation that's provided by people operating in that time period. And of course, we're always going to focus on the philosophy people. Eventually, we always get there. And then we can kind of check in on this quest for truth that's talked about last week. To get started, the historical context of ancient and classical Greece. First thing to note, I'm not a professional historian, classically trained, all of those things. I'm just a philosophy person, but it's necessary to understand the significance of what's happening philosophically to be familiar with the time period that we're talking about. It's always helpful, if not crucially important, to understand some argumentation that occurs at a given time. It's essentially, it just will mean so much more to a person, as well as being familiar with these time periods. Ancient and classical Greece time period, which there's the timeline. I mean, you're talking, 3,000 years of a time period that it operated a long time, and probably, and maybe even before this. And this is the beginning, oftentimes, of what they talk about, like the dawn of Western civilization or Western culture, the Western world, that often, whether accurately or inaccurately, the ancient Greek and classical Greek time periods is considered to be the beginning of the Western world. So, moving forward, that's why it's helpful that the timeline's included. I encourage everyone to look back at this timeline throughout the semester and read some of the descriptions of the various people. And if you do that kind of every week, just glance at it, you'll first of all get a sense of how big a time era that we're looking at, but also some of the people, some of the ideas, or at least some of their names and a few aspects about them. And that's very helpful for orientation purposes. Now, one of the things whenever you learn about any historical period, or you're learning about people or ideas happening in an area of the world that you are not familiar with, even if you think you are, it's notorious that especially people in the U.S. are not very good at geography. That oftentimes we're not very good at ever looking at maps. Well, you cannot go wrong looking at maps and learning how to read maps and kind of understand the terrain, the topography of these places, because that's tremendously helpful to understand sometimes the whole worldview or the mindset of the various people we're talking about. It also helps you understand wars that happened during the times. It helps you understand the politics kind of these times, and their agricultural capabilities if it's a past time, or their industrial capabilities if it's closer to the future. The terrain maps, resource maps, all these kind of maps are extremely helpful. And so we're looking at Greece. So you can't look at Greece without thinking about the Mediterranean Sea. That on your screen, here's Greece, and you can look up maps yourself, and I encourage you to do that. But here's Greece as it is kind of today. And notice it's a bunch of islands at the tail of it, like Crete, and it's just fractured. And you can't get a sense of it with this map. That if you get a map that just focuses on Greece itself, you'll notice that there's hundreds of these things, if not thousands of little islands. That lets a person know immediately that the ancient and classical Greek people are going to be heavily involved with the ocean or the sea and sea travel. And then they're near all these other places. and they're able to take their boats and go from Greece, and they use their boats. That's like their superhighway. This is their interstates of the day. And the classical Greece people, some people that we'll encounter, they have been over here, which is today Sardinia, Corsica, on the bottom part of Italy, the boot here. They were here where Sicily is. They were also the Greeks spread all across their islands, but they traveled. They traveled underneath Turkey, Cyprus, Lebanon, Israel, what the places are today, Egypt, and they followed coastlines a lot of times. But they were familiar with the peoples and cultures all around them, and so there was a huge um, um, just cultural exchanges that happened here, and that's one of the sort of one of the key factors in how did ancient and classical Greece, how did their minds work and their ideas of things. Well, they're near a sea, and they don't have to worry about monstrous storms necessarily in here. But any culture that's an ocean or a sea culture, that are largely, and they depend on it for their livelihood, they're going to have ideas about how precarious life is, and then with the patterns of fish, they'll overfish an area, and then they have to find other areas, and then all these other cultures around them, there can be competitions between them, there can be wars. Like at the time, this is where your Persian Empire is set up over here at the time. And so it's just something to keep in mind. And then also, if you look at this map, you can orientate yourself not just to Greece, but you can also orientate yourself to the Black Sea. I mean, here's Crimea, here's where part of Russia is, here's Ukraine up here. And so that's relevant to contemporary events in the world happening right now. And so the map's invaluable. Just always take a few minutes and look at maps when you're thinking about anything to do with people and events and ideas, and you've never been to such places, and you may have if you've never, especially if you've never been there, and you've never even looked at a map of the places or really paid attention to it, it's worth the time to do it. That being said, there are a few things that we can just pick up, and these are just facts that are reported about the early Greek people in early Greece. That do we know all of these with perfect certainty? No. The records have been lost. Tremendous amounts have been lost because, as I mentioned earlier, there were a lot of wars. There was a lot of conflict, and they're writing on like papyrus style scroll. Was it paper? It's not like paper of today. It deteriorates quicker. It's much rougher. Put together, as well as that if you have stone carvings, that can be destroyed. I mean, in anywhere from 5,000 to 2,000 years ago, in a 5,000 to 2,000 year span of time, peoples have tremendous problems with it's just the history of humanity is like that. Now, the classical Greece and ancient Greece, it's always a mistake to think of it in terms of contemporary Greece. That's like a unified political, economic, well, not economic, but because it's part of the EU. But, it's not an independent economic unit. If you're part of the European Union, that's not what you are. You're part of the union. You use the euro. But at this time, you don't even have like a country you would call Greece, so much as you have the Greek peoples that are scattered over these 1,000+ independent to semi-independent islands, and some of them are much more advanced politically and socially and militarily than others. Some are far less sophisticated, and some are very sophisticated in terms of their writing, their political structures, their constitutions. I mean, they had a lot of sophistication, a lot more than you would think maybe in today's time. But they were also huge. That their main trade potential was with the ocean, with trading luxury items like decorated pottery, decorated houseware stuff besides pottery, They had to import things. They had to import a lot of metal materials, and so they were dependent on trade with other places. They were seafaring people. That's I've already mentioned that. But one of the most important things too about the early Greeks and ancient classical Greece is that they did not have a lot of reliable agricultural land. That some places had decent agricultural capabilities, some places had next to none. And those who had almost no agricultural ability, well, they have to depend on those that do. And all these different domains, these semi-independent to independent city states and communities, they didn't always get along with each other, and that could change very quickly. Who's going to be fighting who? And then piracy was common. They had ocean traders, and they depended on trade. And when you depend on trade, and then you have pirates, not in the swashbuckling kind of skull and crossbones style pirates. No, the boats are much smaller, but they're still can be damaging. Think of like Vikings coming in their boats into, say, what is today England, raiding parties. And they'd come in, and if you have a community, well, they could wipe you out and take everything you had. And so they needed defensive structures. And if they're near an ocean, they're building walls. They're building sort of fortifications to protect themselves from potential invaders. They had conflicts and wars. They had the sort of mythologic war is the Trojan War, but then they also had the Persian War, and then they had the Peloponnesian War. Those are three big ones. They had others, and those wars are divided into subcategories. But I mean, those wars had tremendous impact on the peoples. And they put a lot of effort into their trade goods, their artwork, their poetry. The ancient classical Greeks were almost perfectionists. That they took very good care. A lot of them did, or they prided themselves in being a sort of beautiful people and being very physically fit. That's at least what they made their artwork of. And sure, everybody wasn't a Olympic athlete, but they did pride themselves on their physical appearance. They prided themselves on the quality of their art, their statues, their pottery, their paintings, anything they saw. I mean, some of the islands were like modern day Louis Vuitton or whatever. Just pick whatever luxury brand you want, and that's what some of these Greek islands specialized in. And they also they absorbed ideas from all these other cultures and places. The economies, as I've already said, agricultural, metals, luxury goods. And then it's like we can get a sense of their life with those facts. That's what's important whenever you're thinking about a people of a particular historical period. Look at the maps, look at some of the economic data, the political data, the social data. What was their trade like? Was there agriculture? How did those things, what role did they play in the society at the time? It's all relevant, and it's all so helpful when you get to the philosophy stuff. Now, the thing for as far as moving toward the philosophy stuff, what do we need to kind of imagine in order to understand the worldview, like the early Greeks' worldview? Well, it was a spiritual worldview. Well, what does that mean? We could go back to the What is Philosophy handout that we saw previously, and you can look at that document and then read the entry on spiritual worldview. And it tells you that the most important aspects of truth are to be found in the spiritual rather than in the empirical or in the material realms. And it's not all in our heads. I mean, this stuff matters to them in terms of their worldview. And you can read the entry on the spiritual worldviews. And it's worth doing. Refer back to that document to gain a sense of that before even proceeding in this handout. It's worth the time to go back and at least read in that from the earlier week about the spiritual worldview and what it's like, the way of seeing the world through a spiritual lens. It'll go a tremendously long way to understanding the ancient classical Greek mindset. But these people, they did not have like televisions and radios and the internet. They didn't have any of that. They didn't have newspapers. They depended on word of mouth, primarily, to know what was going on around them. But they were more informed than most, because, and this is the case with a lot of the peoples that lived around the Mediterranean, because they interacted with very different cultures and peoples and economies and politics than their own. So they were well informed about what was going on in their domain of concern. But one of the key things to understand about any of these past people 2,000 years ago is that there was not these huge urban environments with electric street lighting and lights in houses like there is today. Instead, they could go outside at night and see the sky, and it was like the greatest show on earth that every one of them was familiar with, going outside, looking at the sky. And I encourage everybody, just like encouraging everyone to check out maps of places and learn about these places and these time periods, that to really understand like the Greek spiritual view of the cosmos and reality, it's important to first experience a little of what they did. Well, there's one way that we can do that to this day, as humans have done for way more than 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 years back. You can go outside at night somewhere away from a city or an urban environment. Get far enough away that the light from that place doesn't create light pollution. It's not possible for everybody to do, but anybody that can do it, it's worth the time to do it. And just go outside, lay down, take a friend, and look up at the sky for an hour or two. And just look at it, and it's almost inevitable that one will get a sense of the overwhelming nature of the sky and the stars. And if you stare at the sky long enough, the Milky Way starts to show up, the edge of the galaxy and of ours. And you can see, and then think of those stars, that some of those are, it looks like a star, but it's a whole other galaxy. Now, the ancient peoples didn't know that necessarily because they didn't have telescopes, but they did get the overwhelming sense that they are very small and very insignificant in comparison to the reality that they happen to find themselves within. That develops a tremendous sense of humility, and it's worth doing in today's time. Like, I lived in Columbia, South Carolina for 10 years, and if you look up in the night sky and you're in an urban environment, especially, I was in the center of the city near the University of South Carolina, and you could look up and it's just an orange haze where you see one or two of the brightest stars, but you see no more. Everything's washed out. And I remember the sort of, because I grew up in a rural area initially, and it was almost shocking of how it's impossible to see the sky. Whereas in a rural area, you can still see it. Not as well as the ancient peoples, because even in a rural area, normally there's 10 to 20 miles away, there's a city of some size, which light goes in straight lines until bent or refracted or bounced off of something. And so you're still going to have the sky hazed out to a certain extent, even if you're 30 miles from a larger city. But you still get a much better sense of the night sky and the impressiveness or awesomeness or whatever adjective you want to use to describe it. Well, the ancient peoples had that on full display every night. And they socialized with their friends and families, but they also they mapped out the sky. They watched the patterns in the sky. They saw that it seems like almost a fixed background of stars, but then at the same time there's these wandering stars, which are the planets. They look like stars, though, from our point of view on Earth, without any telescopes or binoculars. And so some of these bodies in the sky don't move the same way, or some move, but the whole background doesn't. That has tremendous significance for, say, the medieval period when we get to it. But it had a tremendous impact on these ancient peoples as well. And this was reinforced by the recognition that for the ancient Greeks and the classical Greeks, that their lives were so precarious, that things were not stable, that they could have crop failures, they could have famines, they had these wars, and then that creates a lot of bodies that then the plagues and disease roll in, and that their life was tremendously precarious. They had absolutely no control over whether they're going to exist a day from now or months from now. They had a certain amount of control, but in the grand scheme of things, they recognized that they did not control many things. It wasn't like today that if we, break our arm or we get an infection, that we can go to hospitals and hopefully see about that. They did not have that level of medical sophistication, and so a scratch could turn bad and then they die. And so you have to keep that in mind of this way of thinking about things. They couldn't predict the weather, but they could do predictions. I mean, they caught the seasons. They understood that these patterns repeat of weather conditions at certain times of the year. I mean, they were just like us. They tried to record what was going on and try to predict about what's going to happen next. I mean, and the Babylonians and these other cultures around them, the Persians, had been doing that for well longer than the Greeks, and they had interactions with them through trade. So some of them, as we'll see, one of the pre-Socratics is associated with being able to kind of say that an eclipse is coming up, at least within a certain month, certain months in a certain year, probably using the Babylonian star charts and calculations. But it's impressive how much they were able to kind of predict. But then at the same time, they knew that they were still totally at the mercy of things. So these people are confronted every day with a lot of risk and a lot of gambles. Every time you get on a boat and go out in the Mediterranean Sea, even if you can see the coastline, there's no guarantees that your boat won't spring a leak, that you won't have problems, that you won't get blown off course and get too far away to get back I mean, eventually you'll get back, but it's like very precarious. And so they were keenly aware of life's uncertainties and that death was always a real possibility for them. And yet, these people greatly enjoyed life. And that's one of the most interesting aspects, just in terms of their way of life, is the Greeks saw the world in reality as it's almost, many of them did, not all of them, but many of them, as this fantastic and cool adventure. And they took a lot of time to play. They did competitions. This is your origin of your Olympic Games, where they could be in the middle of a war and they'd put down the war with various other Greek peoples, and then they'd put down their weapons and go compete in the Olympic Games. People that they're trying to spear each other one day, the next day they'll be out there doing competitions, and it's all fun and games. But then after the Olympic Games are over, they go back to their war. And so that's the significance they put in just having fun or competing, or they're in competition creating the most beautiful scenes on pottery. They put so much effort in living, and they were very realistic on the sense of how precarious and fleeting and fragile life was, and their ways of living were. Also, you could say that the Greek sense of life is like filled with, almost like, I mean, their plays reflect this, that they have two main types of plays. They have tragedies, which are horrifying tragedies if you take the time to read them. Most times it is some of the things are very brutal, but then also they have comedies that are just as melodramatic on the other direction. So they have melodramatic tragedies, some of the worst suffering and punishments imaginable in their tragic plays, and then in their comedies, it's like the most absurdist stuff. And base humor that you can also think about, maybe not as much as we've done in the past in the 2,000 years since, but it's something to see, and you can still laugh at some of their jokes. Some of them you won't get today, we won't, but some of them we can. Yeah, and well, how did they make sense of all this? That's their life context. Well, they had their Greek mythos. And mythos, what is it? Well, it's just a group of your origin stories, your histories, your legends, your myths, your religious spiritual beliefs. It includes how you learn about your morality, your value system, your disvalues, all of these things. And one can read through this. That is mythos. The Greek mythos is a part of their worldview. Their life conditions of how precarious life could be, but also the point of living it as an adventure. You combine that with their mythos, and their mythos reflects it. Their stories of the gods and goddesses. All of this reflects the tragedy and the comedy, the heroism, the harrowing conditions they're in. It's reflected in all of their mythos. Now, this is where things get interesting. I mean, if all the previous said isn't interesting, this is certainly interesting. That the Greeks knew and accepted that their poets and playwrights communicated their mythologic legends and their spiritual understanding of the world. It was communicated through poets and playwrights. Poets like Homer and Hesiod, and playwrights like Euripides, Sophocles. You'll see these names. And the way it was always known is that the poets and playwrights are supposedly just channeling these goddesses, the muses. And who are the muses? Well, those are your sources of divine inspiration. They're the friend of the writer, the creative, the poet, the playwright, the curiosity, and the ability to put a lot of words on page. That is, like today we've sometimes said, you'll be writing and it's like a bolt from the blue. All of a sudden you can generate all these words and it all comes together in your mind. You have that aha moment when you're trying to write something, whether it's for a class or for your own enjoyment or whatever. Things just all come together in your mind, and then you can focus and do what you have to do or you want to do. And that's an interaction with the muses in the early Greek mindset. But the muses were they're not reliable sources of information, not completely reliable. And everybody knew this, that the muses sometimes would fabricate things. And so think about that. Your spiritual and your ritual in terms of religious beliefs are connected to your source will play jokes on you. Or this goes along with their sense of adventure of their existence, that the muses were not 100% reliable source, and the poets are taking supposedly everything they're writing from the muses. Well, then you just carry that reasoning forward. It means that what the poets say could never be taken as 100% reliable either. So they've got a spiritual religious basis of their existence that they don't know which parts are true or false. They don't know which are fabrications. They don't know which are truth. And that didn't bother them. That's the interesting. I mean, contrast that sort of epistemic, knowledge base where you can't have much, complete certainty about your spiritual religious outlook on life. Contrast that with some of the other major religions and spiritual perspectives today, like the idea of something like in Christianity, you have the Bible. It's supposed to be accurate. It's not supposed to be, well, who knows? Not for a believer. That God wouldn't let there be for Christians. God wouldn't let all these people that wrote the books of the Bible be too far mistaken. Contrast that with the ancient classical Greek view of that the poets are getting all their information from these goddesses, the muses, and the muses are known to fabricate things sometimes. They'd rather tell a good story and have the poets tell a good story rather than necessarily have a perfectly accurate story. It's a very big difference. and it's interesting. But the hallmark of all of Greek mythology or mythos is that humans are always at the complete mercy of the gods and the goddesses. And the gods and goddesses are very human-like. They look human. Most of them do, not all of them, but most of them look human. They wear clothes. They eat food. They drink their wine. They have big parties at Mount Olympus. Those the Olympian gods do and goddesses. But there's also these spiritual forces, and there's also these sort of personified emotions, like they would have gods for um, ruin or temporary insanity, or they would have gods for war, and that it's just it's absolutely worth the time to look up Greek mythology and get involved, read their stories, or watch YouTube videos or whatever videos on these stories. And if you stick with it long enough, you'll get a real good sense of how humans are always caught up in the wily ways of what the gods and the goddesses are doing. I mean, these people were walking elbow to elbow, like their gods and goddesses would take human form and be walking among them and causing all kinds of problems. For their own interest. Humans really were largely irrelevant and could just become irritating to the gods and goddesses. I mean, it's like humans were not the most important things on our on in reality. We were in a sense the most insignificant and irrelevant. I mean, there was gods and goddesses in the plants that grow by the rivers. There's nymphs and what today would be referred to as elves or whatever, like woodland spirits and river spirits and ocean spirits just everywhere, bursting at the seams. The reality is filled with gods and goddesses. That's the worldview. It's a worldview where everything is magical and fantastical, and yet a very real understanding of how humans are totally at the mercy of that. And we can't control that, or they couldn't. So they accepted. It's like you accept your lot in life. And in the Greek sort of spiritual worldview, humans really were they were largely irrelevant. What mattered, the biggest show on earth, was what the gods and the goddesses were up to, not what we were up to. And now one might be tempted to judge this spiritual view, this Greek mythology, and say, from for a contemporary point of view, you might look at it and say, yeah, well, that's interesting, but that's all just fake stuff. That's a mistake. If you really want to understand a people and understand the philosophy that comes out of this stuff, or that appears in response to it, that it'd be a mistake to just by default assume that they're mistaken about everything. I mean, the Greeks accepted that the large parts of their spiritual view could be fabrications of the muses handed to the poets just because the muses wanted a great story told, rather than what actually happened historically. They accepted that. That didn't bother them. They still understood or believed or thought that at least some of it's true. And if all of your stories that are being relayed by the poets and the playwrights involve tons of gods and goddesses, so, I mean, it's just worth thinking about. But also, these people were not, as the word, like say the Romans called everybody that wasn't Roman barbarians, or just, wild, not able to even speak clearly if they didn't speak Latin. It would be a mistake to take that same perspective and apply it to these ancient classical Greeks. Sure, they had their wars. They lived in a much less technologically sophisticated world than we do today, but they were not, by no means were they unintelligent or less rational than we are. They had their moral systems. They could be happy. That there is no guarantees that they didn't have a better bead on the way reality is than we do today. And recognizing that is very important to think more like a philosophy person. That in philosophy you can always be mistaken, especially because we're all in a particular worldviews ourselves of today in a hyper technologically based world. They were not in a hyper technologically based world, but they had just as much complexity in their spiritual worldview as we do in our technological, sort of scientific, industrial worldviews that are more predominant today. Just as sophisticated, they were able to think and reason their way, in some ways perhaps better than we can today. We'll see that as we go through the semester. Essentially, these people were not idiots, and it's a very terrible mistake to think they were. But they lived a different life than we do, and they had a different spiritual mindset than we do. I mean, not everybody, but many people in the contemporary Western world, at least, that we're heavily science based. And we'll get to all that throughout the semester. But the questions, so there's many questions that the poets and the playwrights answered. Remember, in philosophy, you can always find a pattern. Questions are asked, answers are provided. Then in philosophy, reasons are offered in support of those answers, and then you deal with objections and replies. Well, if you approach the Greek mythos, the early Greek spiritual worldview, in terms of that, what you'll see is that early Greek peoples, they asked questions like we do today. What's the nature of reality? How does all this that we see and interact with every day, how did it come about? Like, why are our lives so hard sometimes? Why couldn't everything be easy? They ask those same questions. Like, who or what causes, sometimes we'll fall in love with someone and it turns out not to be the best, situation for us. Well, what brought that about? If you reverse it after it's failed and it was disaster, you wonder, why didn't I see those aspects of this person to begin with? The early Greeks asked the same kind of questions. Where does creativity come from? Where does all the badness in the world come from? What's the cause of it? What's the origin? What's the origin of everything? All of those questions, Greek mythos provides answers for. The answers, just some of these above questions, like what's the nature of reality? Well, and you can read the handout, is filled to the brim with gods and goddesses and personified forces. Like they have personified blame. Is like a human almost that's invisible or could be visible at times that jumps through our minds and makes us blame one another for things. Distress, that's also divine or spiritual. Famine, that's like a force, like almost like a person-like force that rolls through your community, and then everybody's starving. It's interesting. And then also they had their gods and their goddesses that were anthropomorphic, meaning human or human-like. They have all these traits and characteristics. They have hands and feet and toes, and eyes. They're just bigger than we are. They're also immortal. But then they can get killed or almost killed. And so it's like, man, that's the nature of reality for these people. But then again, they don't know how much of that's true or false. Because of the source from the poets that are getting it from the muses that like good stories, but maybe not the most accurate at times. So the world in reality is full of gods. That's your metaphysical picture of the universe or reality. And then I have lots of examples of this. But these various feelings, these personified feelings, like they have one Ate or Ate. This is the goddess of delusion, mischief, and ruin. And this is a very common phrase or statement that one will see from time to time if you read enough history. It's like, whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad or crazy or irrational. This is how they would explain, like, why did a leader, or why did a certain group of leaders, it's like it seems obvious in retrospect that, say, a decision to go to war was a bad idea. or it's going to be bad for the economy and many people are going to suffer, but it's also going to be bad for all the people that get killed in the war and the families and their children. Devastating. And you look back and, in hindsight, we can look back and say, why did our leaders choose to do that? They could have seen and could have kind of known that this was going to turn out badly, to take on a group that's much more powerful than they are, for example, but they did it anyway. Well, one of the ways the Greek mythos explains that is to say, well, there's this goddess, Ati, that gets in their minds. And then it makes them crazy and do crazy, irrational things. And that's what the gods and goddesses, before they destroy that person or that community or society, before they destroy them or ruin them or set them back for decades of suffering, they make them crazy first. It's interesting. It's an explanation. It's an answer to the question, why did our leaders make these bad decisions? Well, Ati's one answer, that goddess. And then these gods and goddesses, they experience these superhuman emotions, like that you can get a goddess that gets mad or feelings hurt or insulted, and then whole wars are fought about that. That's the origin of the Trojan War, at least according to Homer and others. Then they have their own proprietary domains, and you can read through this. There's no reason to read through all this. So if you go through that, you'll have an answer of what is the nature of reality. The poets and playwrights were giving you that core metaphysics question. That's the heart and soul of metaphysics is, what's the nature of reality? What's the most fundamental aspects and features of it? How does that impact human lives and divine, if you're operating in a spiritual worldview? And so they had answers to that. And it's provided by the early Greek spiritual worldview. Well, then also, what about morality and ethics? What for these people counts as acting rightly and wrongly? Well, not doing the ritual from a human to human point of view. You can look at Hesiod, and he'll tell you that violent behavior is bad. Hesiod's kind of a rural poet, whereas Homer is a more urban poet. And in these periods of time, Hesiod lives out in the hills and the valleys and the agricultural lands away from the urban centers. He goes to them, but he exists primarily with his sheep, shepherding, things like that. Whereas someone like Homer's more urban. And that's their backgrounds, at least, as far as we know. And so in terms of human on human, violent behavior is bad. Taking advantage of your neighbors is bad. It should be doing fraud, corruption, not doing right in your judicial systems. Yes, indeed. These people had judicial systems. They had constitutions. They had laws, not to the extent that we do with millions upon millions of written laws and things that most people don't even know about. They didn't have it to that extent, but they did have judges. They did have juries. They had things like that. We'll see that when we get to Socrates. But violence and vice and all this bad stuff, that's bad. That's how they get their morality out of their poets and playwrights. And then there's he summarizes, Hesiod summarizes all of it. Plan harm for another and harm yourself most. So you only hurt yourself if you're planning or trying to hurt someone else. You reap what you sow is the kind of human to human stuff. You're bad to someone, they'll be bad back to you, or you'll get bad done back to you eventually. That you're not getting away with anything for free. And there's also one of the worst things you can do as far as the gods and the goddesses go is to not do the right rituals, but more than anything else is hubris. Thinking that you're superior or better than or can out-create something that a god or a goddess can do, or that you can challenge fate, that you're fated to have a certain existence, but you as a human think you can do better than that, and that you can do better, you can outdo the gods or goddesses. That is always punished horrifically badly in the Greek stories, their spiritual stories. I mean, there's tons of it, and there's examples in this handout of it. It's certainly worth reading. And what all of this does is it makes humans very humble and deferential and compliant in regards to the spiritual realm and reality that they inhabit. And that's crucially important for understanding this mindset. There's also answers to why is life so hard? Where did humans come from? I provided examples of this. There's Pandora, really interesting idea of what is hope. And first of all, badness in the world, why do we always seem to have some hope? Why can we maintain a little hope for a better outcome? Well, the Greeks answer the Greek mythos answers that question for you. It gives you an answer. I'm not saying it's the right answer. Do you remember, these are just answers to these questions. They're proposals. You can wonder about the genealogy of the gods and goddesses. You can wonder about what happened at the beginning of the universe, etc. Now, the reasons in argumentation, did the poets provide a bunch of reasoning and evidence for what they claim about Aphrodite and Zeus? No. There's not a lot of it. There's more than you might think at times, but there's not a lot of it. They're not doing argumentation. They're not trying to convince people by reasoning and saying, yeah, here's the evidence of Aphrodite's actions in this story. They don't do that. And that leaves them open to challenge later down the line. That's one of the big distinctions between the poets and the playwrights and what they're up to with the spiritual worldview versus the pre-Socratics. But you got to think about it. Would it bother the ancient classical Greeks that they did not have all these reasons for, well, in the classical period, they started to be bothered by it. But in the ancient time, no, it didn't seem to bother them. It may have, but we don't have any records to the effect that it did. But one of the biggest objections, excuse me, and this is where there's a shifting of the worldview, is that the early Greeks had this spiritual worldview. The world's filled with gods and goddesses that are intruding, interfering with, we're at the mercy of as far as humans. Well, and they're human-like. Well, then the key objections that occurred later, more into the classical period of Greece, is that you get someone like Xenophanes, this guy, Xenophanes. And he observes that, well, isn't this quite absurd that all the gods and the goddesses are so human-like? Well, might it be that if horses had gods, they'd look like horses? This all seems quite convenient, and maybe it's all made up. And there's even some besides Xenophanes that talk about, that the religious and spiritual worldview was created by various political people to control the masses. Kind of like some may have heard of Karl Marx and his line that religion's the opiate of the masses or the opiate of the peoples. That idea was all the way back at the time of Xenophanes and after. So these are the kind of objections that these gods and goddesses, that not only are they human-like, which seems strange to Xenophanes, but also they're the worst kind of humans. That they're deceitful, they're malicious, they get super jealous, super envious, and then they act out in these murderous, terrible ways. Is that the kind of moral framework we want to operate with? This is where things start to change. And so Xenophanes, it's described in this handout of how that works. They imply a greater degree of skepticism than existed before. Or maybe it was always there in a sort of nascent sense. The Greeks, like I said, they never seemed to believe fully all of their own stories. But they did believe and operate and act accordingly through rituals and various things. But then there's more skepticism about that comes about. People, someone like Xenophanes and others start really doubting this. But then at the same time, Xenophanes still introduces this notion of a different kind of God than what was normally characterized by the poets and playwrights in ancient Greece. So it's like there's a move away from the early Greek spiritual worldview, but it's not a perfect break. It's not like Xenophanes was an atheist and just says, there's no gods and goddesses. There's no spiritual aspect to reality at all. No, what instead Xenophanes does is he says that it's not like what they talk about. Those like Zeus and Hera and Aphrodite and Poseidon. Those are gods not really worth worrying with, because they're too human. But there is this sort of being that's extremely powerful, that he can, and he says it's he, that it can move things just with the power of its mind, things like that. But what Xenophanes, one of the key takeaways, is he's proposing an alternative greater God that's depersonalized. It's not a caring, loving thing. It's not something, it's interacting with reality at all times in all kinds of ways, but it's not human like very much at all. And there's this notion that it wouldn't befit a god or a goddess. It would be beneath a god or a goddess to have to move or have to wear clothes or think like humans. It needs to be entirely different from us. This is a much more abstract divine picture. So not only is Xenophanes criticizing the old, he's trying to offer an alternative new. And that's a transition that happens at the time of Xenophanes and going forward. And then we're reaching the Pre-Socratics. The Pre-Socratics, we do not have a lot of records for these people. We have much more for the poets and the playwrights, actually, than we do for the Pre-Socratics, the very first philosophy people, in terms of Western philosophy. These are pre-Socrates, which we get to Socrates very soon, next week. But the thing is that they were always engaged in. If you want to know about the Pre-Socratics, the easiest way to think about it is keep that Greek mythos picture in your mind, and then think offering alternative gods to that picture, as well as in some case just pulling all the personal characteristics away, and instead of gods and goddesses, offering more materialistic explanations and elements and processes that are controlling and forming and composing reality, causing all the change and the motions that we see. Seeing that trees grow, they reach a maturity, then they die, and then they go back to the earth. These processes that you can witness in the life world, or the oceans pulling the coast away, then it puts more sand and shells. So there's this constant changes all around us. And our children are born, they become, they get to elementary age, middle school age, high school age, college age, and they're adults. They go forth in the world. The Greeks could see this too. And so they were trying to look for, they would have one explanation of that could be provided by poets and playwrights. Well, the Pre-Socratics offer alternative explanations for that. And those explanations do not involve person-like, human-like gods and goddesses. So the Pre-Socratics, like I said, we have little information about them. There's a lot of questions they answer. They do try to address, we just don't have the records, but one could suppose or speculate that the Pre-Socratics wrote a significant amount, and they probably did try to address many of the same kind of questions and just provide alternative answers to them as the poets and playwrights were doing. But one of them, just to simplify things, is we can think of this metaphysical question and that's the way we kind of focus on the Pre-Socratics in this handout. But you could also focus on ethical questions or more epistemological questions, talking about knowledge and how we know any of this stuff. They address questions like that. But for our purposes, we just look at this one metaphysical question, like what is the most primordial, fundamental entities, elements, forces, constituting, originating, governing, causing movements and change within reality? Like in the Greek spiritual worldview, well, this is gods and goddesses. But automatically we're talking about something different. It's like we're not talking about what god or goddess is responsible for lightning and storms in the ocean and the animal migration patterns. The Pre-Socratics aren't referring to anything like the standard Greek mythology as a way to explain what's going on with those things. No, they're trying to explain what today many would say, well, these are natural phenomena like earthquakes or it rains sometimes and it doesn't. That's a weather phenomena. That's not a Zeus phenomena. That's a weather phenomena. And so the pre-Socratics are making that first mental step away from the mythology, and then they take the second step. It's one thing to say, I don't think that the Greek pantheon of gods and goddesses is accurate. That's one thing you can do. That's one move a person can make. The next move is to say, I think that that God or goddesses is much more abstract. It's different than a human, very far removed from human ways. That's a step you can take. Well, then the next step you can do is try to say, well, why don't we try to look at these phenomena in the world and explain worldly stuff in terms of worldly stuff? That instead of seeing the world as shot through with gods and goddesses, instead we think in terms of materials, atoms and void and water and fire and earth, things that humans see and interact with all the time. Automatically there's a disconnect mentally that's going on there. Now, Thales is so how does Thales answer this question? What's the most fundamental X, meaning entities, elements, forces, constituting, causing all that we see, what that's making up reality? Well, for Thales, water. Water is the first principle. Do we understand his reasoning? No, we don't have those records. And this is all according to Aristotle. Like, we have nothing that Thales himself wrote down. We just have what people and philosophy people, etc., that lived after Thales said he said. But Thales is always associated with saying that the core of reality is water. Okay, that's fine. But that's a whole lot different than saying it's the whole pantheon of gods and goddesses. And so, and there's ways you can make that seem more reasonable, that life, everywhere life is, seems to have water most times. And that if you open up seeds, a lot of times the inside of them it has a moisture content. Various things. Aristotle speculated about how Thales reasoned his way to saying that water is the one thing that accounts for the many diverse things we see in existence. Anaximander, he didn't like water. He didn't like Thales' answer, so he comes up with an alternative. The most fundamental nature of reality, what composes it the most, is the boundless. Well, this is really an interesting concept. It's very abstract from water. You can put water in a bucket and carry it around. You can drink it. You can swim in it. But what do you do with the boundless? Well, the boundless is this unlimited something. But one way to think about it is you can think of the boundless in like a universal substance or a universal material out of which all the other things that we see that we interact with, that they're composed of. It's really close in some ways. It's not limited to just biology, but you can think of like fetal stem cells that can form into hearts and livers and kidney cells. They start out, though, as a kind of universal Swiss Army knife kind of thing that they can become the tool is needed at the time. So you have this sort of base layer of material that's not forced into any particular kind of material at a given time, but it can transform into whatever other diverse things, cows and plants and water. I mean, this is where fire can be made of it, water, earth. But it's a lot like in contemporary theoretical quantum mechanics and physics. There's this proposal of like superstrings in M theory, and there's an example of that that's mentioned in one of the supporting videos of this week. That today's theoretical quantum physicists are still doing the same pre-Socratic task. Keep in mind, almost all the disciplines that you know of, from biology to physics to even engineering, a lot of these things originated in the context of philosophy, or at least the ideas. But the key with someone like Parmenides here with his boundless is that you have a sort of base layer universal substance that can become all the other things that you see. Or Anaximander. Yeah, Anaximander is the boundless. Then there's Anaximenes. he offers an alternative to Anaximander's Boundless, and Anaximenes offers air as an alternative. Heraclitus is fire and flux. Heraclitus is everything's moving around all the time in all kinds of ways. It's constantly transforming, changing. Nothing is ever static. Nothing is ever still. That everything's wiggly jiggly all the time, and that's how we get motion and change in the world. And that fire is the best analog to think of what's the most primordial, fundamental stuff. Parmenides goes the other way, is that all is one, and that motion and change is an illusion. Now you can read through Zeno's arguments here. He was right in the same way of thinking as Zeno, and I encourage people read Zeno's argument of why motion's impossible, why there can be no change, why you can't actually walk from one side of a room to another. It's interesting. See if you can figure out where Zeno go wrong. If you think he's wrong, if you think you can walk across the street, which I suspect most people in the class do, well, read Zeno's argument and then say, well, how can I respond to him? Because he's saying you can't. Zeno says the chicken can never cross the road. It's not possible. So that's interesting. Why would anyone think such a thing? You can read Zeno's argument and find out. It's here. It's right here. Right there, if you want to check it out. Pythagoras, most people in the class will have heard of the Pythagorean theorem. Some people say that Pythagoras came up with it. Some people say, well, he got it from various other peoples, various Persians, Egyptians, possibilities. Either way, it's got his name in the front of it. It's used in geometry, trigonometry, engineering. You use it anywhere there's triangles. Then Pythagoras has often attributed this idea that everything's fundamentally number. And this is number not like the letter or the symbol 2, 3, or the plus sign. That's not what he means, what he would have meant by that, or that's not what they think he would have meant by that. It's more like the formulas that you encounter in engineering or physics classes or algebra, where you have, like, say, the Pythagorean theorem. That it's not the words on the page that matter. That's not what's most real. It's the phenomena that those numbers are capturing and enabling us to predict things about and build things with. That it's what the formulas are indicating in reality. That's what the most real stuff is its number or formula patterns. Empedocles, he said the most fundamental stuffs, earth, air, fire, water, and that everything's made of these, and then these forces of love and strife, not like gods and goddesses, sort of though, that they cause things to pull apart or come together. Anaxagoras is nous, or nos, however one wants to pronounce it. It's like this force that rationally governs all of reality, that there's an order to things. Like, remember in Greek mythos, there's an order. There's a genealogy of gods and goddesses. One god begets another one, and they have relationships, and you have half gods and half humans, and you have spirits and forces. So there's an ordering. That's one hallmark of ancient classical Greek thinking, is that you should be able to make sense of the reality we happen to find ourselves in. And with the pre-Socratics, what you're getting is they're swapping out the traditional Greek pantheon of gods and goddesses. They're adding in alternative explanations of these elements and forces that are not nearly as deified or personified. But then again, you end up with it's not a clean break. It's not like one day all became atheists. No, that's not how this worked. It's a slow process. Democritus is your first atomic theory, that it's the atoms in the void. And it's really interesting that this shows up all the way back to 2,500 years ago, that you have someone talking about there's these indivisible particles, they're atoms, and they glom together and form all the cows and pigs and chickens and everything else, and trees and flowers and things we see in the cosmos. It's almost like an elements approach. to it, but it's also similar to the Anaximander's Boundless as well. Then, so in summary, the pre-Socratics, they do, and they appear to be, and they really seem to be doing something quite different than what the poets and the playwrights were doing. Moreover, these pre-Socratics, it's not gone through in great detail in the as much as it could be in this handout, but they did try to offer reasoning for everything that they were saying. But the reason that's not emphasized as much is because our records are spotty. But eventually, more will be added. Now, summary: the pre-Socratics, they're taking the first steps toward what could be called a more naturalistic, proto-science worldview. They're taking the steps away from a spiritualized worldview, but they're not immediately making a total break from it either. But they are taking those steps, and that's why normally the pre-Socratics are associated as being like proto-science. They're moving mentally and theoretically, and in terms of the way they're reasoning and thinking about things, trying to explain things. They're moving more toward where science eventually develops. Yep. And then there's also, though, people that some of them see this as some people sort of interpretations of how are we as today contemporary people supposed to understand the significance of what the pre-Socratics were doing. You can ask that question, like what did they do that was so impressive? Well, some would say they're very impressive because they're pre-science, and they're getting rid of this barbaric sort of mythology and human-like gods and goddesses. They're moving us more towards science, and that's progress. That's becoming more intelligent, leaving our childlike mindset behind and moving to this much more mature science technological mindset. That's how one way to interpret what the pre-Socratics are doing. That would be your positive, your laude, as it'd be in Latin, your praiseworthy way of describing what they were up to. And there's examples of that. This notion of transhumanism, I've mentioned it here, is that they're getting us on the path of where we try to transform ourselves through science and technology to become maybe one day gods ourselves. That we use our technologies and maybe we can get superhuman powers one day ourselves. There are people that believe that and want that to happen. You may not think that, but there are. And that mentality of the world's created in the image and populated and dependent on gods and goddesses versus why not remake the world however humans want it to be? That is something that some people very much like that about the pre-Socratics. Some thinkers, some politicians, for example, some very powerful people in today's world support this. They put lots of money into this to remake the world in our image as humans. Conversely, there's other people that see what the pre-Socratics do is a great tragedy. Like, and that mourn the loss of this spiritual worldview that was so well developed in ancient and classical Greece. I mean, like I said, we have so much about ancient and classical Greek mythos. We have very little about pre-Socratics. So in a sense, it's an indicator to you. But now keep in mind, the pre-Socratics didn't just instantly destroy the Greek mythology and worldview. The pre-Socratics were a small group of people that had a big impact in time. But at their own time, they were respected. They were thought to be intelligent people, and they were. And they had ideas that were unique and interesting. And the Greeks loved new ideas. They loved thinking about them. But the Greek mythos carried on all the way through the Roman Empire. And so that's many, many, many years beyond the pre-Socratics, beyond Socrates and Plato and the rest too. So that philosophy's impact in terms of these pre-Socratics took time. It incubates for a long period of time, and then it goes backwards. And, or it doesn't go backwards necessarily, but it goes to a spiritual perspective again, and then it's in the empirical and industrial and technological perspective. This stuff ebbs and flows. But don't think that the pre-Socratics just wiped the spiritual worldview off the map. They didn't. Most Greeks would have still been thinking in terms of spiritual worldview, in terms of Aphrodite. They still kept building their temples. They still kept doing their worship rituals. But the pre-Socratics were thinking, and there's a crafting of a very different way of thinking about reality and the world that's just starting to emerge in the pre-Socratics. And so, how does this impact our quest for truth? Remember, in philosophy, this is the whole point of of everything. Is well, did the Greek mythos, did it capture something that's very true and important about the reality we find ourselves in, even in the contemporary world? Or what about the pre-Socratics? Did it capture something, this idea of trying to explain the world in terms of natural things versus the Greek mythos trying to account for reality in terms of spirituality? That might both of those have some truth to offer us? Might they both be like, think of truth as the old analogy of the elephant in the room, and one person grabs the trunk and says, aha, it's in a dark room, they can't see the whole elephant. So one person grabs the trunk and says, well, it's more like a snake, a big, powerful snake. Someone grabs the leg of the elephant, another person, they can't see the whole elephant, and they say, no, it's more like a trunk of a tree. Then someone grabs the tail and says, no, this is more like a worm. In all of them, and the elephant is like the analog to truth. And so could the Greek spirit, the early Greek spiritual worldview, be grabbing on to aspects of truth? Like maybe it's a good thing for humans to be more humble rather than think they can become gods. And then, or the pre-Socratics, where the emergence, this nascent proto-science. I mean, clearly with science, we can build very impressive machinery and things. This whole class is running on the technological achievements of engineering informed by various, more physics, etc., science. So might both of these sort of ways of thinking about things have value and be capturing on to aspects of reality, these immovable parts of reality. It's just something to think about. So everyone's thoughts. But that's the end of this. There's a bibliography if you want to go through, read some of this. This is not the full bibliographic information, but it's enough that you can look up some of the various things and learn more about what's been described in this handout. But I hope this video is helpful. Until next time.